When we first moved into the house, I thought it was perfect. It was a modest two-story home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a small-town dream. The backyard was big enough for my son, Ben, to play in, and the house itself had a cozy, lived-in feel. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was ours, and after a few tough years, that was all that mattered. At first, everything was normal. For the first few weeks, we settled in, unpacking boxes, painting the walls, and making the place feel like home. Ben, who had just turned 5, was especially excited about his new bedroom. He loved the big windows and the little alcove where we put his toy chest. "This is the best house ever," he declared one night, climbing into bed. I tucked him in, kissed his forehead, and switched off the light. I had no idea that it would be the last peaceful night we'd have in that house. It started with the handprints. I had spent an entire weekend painting the downstairs hallway, carefully applying 2 coats of soft beige paint to cover the old, peeling wallpaper. It had been exhausting, but when I stepped back and admired my work, I felt proud. The next morning, when I came downstairs, I froze. Tiny handprints, child-sized, smeared, and faintly greasy, were scattered across the lower half of the hallway wall. I frowned, touching one of them. The paint was dry, but the prints shouldn't have been there. "Ben?" I called, already knowing he couldn't be responsible. He had been with me all night. Still, I found him in the living room, playing with his toys. "Did you touch the walls after I painted?" I asked gently. He shook his head without looking up. "No, Mommy." I stared at the handprints for a long time. Then, with a sigh, I grabbed a sponge and scrubbed them away. 2 days later, they were back. Same spot, same size. This time, I felt a chill creep up my spine. I called my best friend, Lisa, and told her about it. "Maybe it's just the paint drying weird," she suggested. I wanted to believe her. So, once again, I cleaned the wall and pushed the thought out of my mind. But I couldn't ignore what happened next. One night, after putting Ben to bed, I was in the kitchen finishing up the dishes. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of the wind outside. Then, out of nowhere, a thump, soft, but unmistakable. It came from upstairs. I paused, my hands still in the soapy water. Another thump. It sounded like something small and heavy hitting the floor. I dried my hands and went to check on Ben. When I opened his door, my breath caught in my throat. His stuffed rabbit, his favorite toy, was sitting in the middle of the floor. I frowned. "Ben?" He stirred in his bed, groggy. "Why did you throw your rabbit?" I asked. He blinked up at me, confused. I didn't. I stared at him for a moment. Then I picked up the rabbit, placed it back beside him, and kissed his forehead. But as I pulled away, he whispered something that made my stomach drop. "The other boy did it." I forced a smile. "What other boy, sweetheart?" Ben yawned, turning onto his side. "The boy in the closet." I felt a wave of ice-cold dread wash over me. I turned to the closet door. It was closed. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to act normal. "There's no boy in the closet, Ben," I said softly. He just nodded sleepily. "Okay." I turned off the light and walked out, shutting the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. I kept finding Ben's toys moved, placed in odd spots, stacked in strange ways. One morning, I found all of his little cars arranged in a perfect circle on his bedroom floor. Another time, I walked into the bathroom to find the faucet running at full blast. And the handprints? They kept appearing, not just in the hallway anymore, but on the mirrors, the windows, even on the back of my bedroom door. I was beginning to feel like I was losing my mind. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of Ben crying. I ran to his room, my heart hammering. He was sitting up in bed, his little body trembling, his face streaked with tears. I rushed to him. "What's wrong, baby?" He clutched his stuffed rabbit tightly. "The boy," he sobbed. "The boy was in my bed." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" I whispered. He hiccuped. He was lying next to me. He said he wanted to play. My skin crawled. I held Ben close, whispering reassurances, but inside, I was terrified. Something was in this house with us. And whatever it was, It wasn't going away. That was the night I decided to do some digging. I spent hours online, searching for anything about the house. Then, finally, I found it. A news article. 30 years ago, a 7-year-old boy named Daniel Carter had died in this house. He had fallen down the stairs, hitting his head on the hardwood floor. His parents had been out, leaving him alone for the first time. By the time they got home, it was too late. A cold chill ran down my spine. Ben was 5. The handprints, they were child-sized. And the toys moving on their own? It wasn't just a ghost. It was a lonely little boy. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to move, to pack up and leave. But I also felt something else, pity. Daniel wasn't evil. He wasn't hurting Ben. He was just lost. That night, I did something I never thought I'd do. I sat in Ben's room after he fell asleep, and I whispered into the dark. "Daniel," I said softly, "I know you're here." The room was silent. I swallowed. You don't have to be scared. You don't have to be alone. A soft creak sounded from the closet. I squeezed my hands into fists. "It's okay," I whispered. "You can rest now." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, I swear to God, I felt something brush against my shoulder, like the touch of a small hand. A rush of cold air swept through the room, and then, the closet door slowly creaked open. But there was no one there. Just the empty dark. The handprints never came back after that. The toys stopped moving. And Ben? He never spoke of the other boy again. Whatever had been in our house, I think it finally let go. I hope Daniel found his way home. Small towns hide their secrets well. They bury them deep beneath polite smiles, whispered rumors, and the kind of silence that feels heavier than words. Even when something terrible happens, people don't like to talk about it. They pretend it never happened, like ignoring the truth will somehow make it go away. But some things don't just go away. Some tragedies stay, waiting for someone to dig them up. I should know, because I was the one who did. My younger brother, Ethan, died 6 years ago. They told me it was an accident. He was 19, a college freshman back home for the summer. One night, he went out with some friends and never came back. The next morning, his body was found in Sablefield, just outside of town. His neck was broken. The official report said he had been drinking and must have tripped on something in the dark. But I never believed that, because I knew my brother. And Ethan was afraid of that field. Ethan and I grew up here, just the two of us and our mom. We were close, closer than most siblings. Mom worked long hours, so we spent most of our childhood outside, riding bikes, exploring, making up stories. And like every small town, ours had its off-limits places kids told stories about. For us, that was Sablefield. It wasn't anything special, just a stretch of overgrown grass behind the old mill, surrounded by a thick line of trees. But everyone knew not to go there at night. Some kids swore they had seen shadows moving in the grass, even when there was no wind. Others claimed they heard whispers when they got too close. Ethan never liked the place. He always said there was something wrong with it, something waiting there. So when I heard that's where they found his body, I knew. I knew it wasn't an accident. Someone had put him there, but no one wanted to listen. Not the cops, not my mother, not even Ethan's so-called friends. They all just accepted it. They mourned, held the funeral, lowered his casket into the ground, and moved on. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I spent the next 6 years haunted by questions no one wanted to ask. I left town for college, but I never stopped thinking about Ethan. About the way his body had been found face down in the field, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. About the footprints the police never explained. About the missing phone, the missing shoes, the missing time between when he left the house and when they found him. None of it made sense. And the worst part? The people in town didn't seem surprised. It was like they had expected it, like they had seen it happen before. When I finally moved back last year, I decided I wouldn't rest until I found out the truth. I started with Ethan's friends, the last people to see him alive. Most of them still lived in town, still working the same dead-end jobs, still going to the same bars every weekend. At first, they wouldn't talk to me. Then they started avoiding me. That only made me push harder. I cornered one of them, Jake Hall, Ethan's best friend. outside a gas station. He looked rough, thinner than I remembered, like he hadn't been sleeping well. When he saw me, his face went pale. "Look, man," he said, glancing around nervously. "You need to drop this." I stepped closer. "Tell me what happened that night." Jake swallowed hard. "I can't." "Why?" He looked past me, eyes darting toward the trees lining the edge of the parking lot. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because I don't want to end up like Ethan." That was the moment I knew. Something had happened in that field. Something bad. Something Jake was too scared to talk about. I needed to see it for myself. The night I went to Sable Field, the air was too still. No wind, no crickets, nothing. The grass was overgrown, waist high in some places, swaying even though there was no breeze. The trees formed a perfect, suffocating circle around the clearing, their branches stretching out like arms. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where Ethan's body had been found. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, barely audible, like someone calling my name. I turned sharply, my heart slamming against my ribs. No one was there. The field was empty. Then why did it feel like I wasn't alone? I took a shaky breath, my fingers curling into fists. "This place isn't haunted," I muttered to myself. "It's just a damn field." But the words felt wrong, like I was lying, like something was listening, watching, waiting. I left that night with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Ethan's death wasn't an accident, and the town knew more than they were letting on. I kept pushing, digging through old records, newspaper archives, anything I could find about Sable Field. And that's when I found it. The other deaths. 3 boys. All found in the exact same spot as Ethan. All under mysterious circumstances. And all of their deaths were ruled accidents. I confronted Jake again. This time, he didn't run. He just looked tired. "You really want to know?" he said. "Yes." Jake exhaled slowly. Then he told me the real story. That night, Ethan had been dared to go to the field alone. A stupid prank. A test of bravery. But something went wrong. Jake and the others waited at the edge of the trees, laughing, expecting him to come running back. But instead, they heard screaming. Not a normal scream. Something distorted. Like Ethan was being dragged underwater. When they ran in, he was already dead. No struggle. No signs of a fight. Just lying there. Like something had dropped him. Like he had fallen from the sky. I stared at Jake, my skin crawling. He met my gaze, his voice hollow. "You ever hear the stories? About the whispers?" I nodded. He swallowed. "They're not whispers." He glanced over his shoulder, lowering his voice. "They're calling, waiting for someone to answer." A long silence stretched between us. Then he whispered. That night, Ethan answered. I left town the next morning. I didn't go back to Sable Field. I didn't need to, because I finally understood. Ethan's death wasn't an accident, and he wasn't the first. He was just the latest. And as long as that field is still there, he won't be the last. Some roads feel different at night. It's not just the darkness, it's something else. A weight in the air. A silence that feels too deep, like the road is holding its breath. Like something is waiting. That's how I felt the night I drove home, through Old Mill Road. I had taken that route 100 times before, but that night was different. That night, I wasn't alone. I was 17 when it happened. I had just finished a late shift at the diner where I worked. It was past midnight, and my feet ached from standing all day. I wanted nothing more than to go home, take a hot shower, and sleep for a week. But first, I had to make the drive. My town was small, and the quickest way home was Old Mill Road, a long, winding stretch of pavement that cut through miles of dense forest. During the day, it was peaceful. At night, it was something else. The trees pressed in from both sides, their tangled branches blocking out the sky. The road had no streetlights, no houses, no signs of life. Just darkness stretching for miles. I had never liked driving it at night, but that night, I had no choice. I turned onto Old Mill Road, my headlights cutting through the gloom. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the faint whisper of the wind through the trees. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It's just another drive home, I told myself. Nothing to be scared of. But then I saw the headlights. A single car, way behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. But as I drove, the car stayed there, matching my speed, never getting closer, never falling behind. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the feeling growing in my gut. Maybe they just live out this way, I reasoned. But then I realized I had never seen another car on this road at night, and there were no houses out here. I pressed the gas, speeding up. So did they. My heart started to pound. I slowed down. So did they. They were copying me, testing me. I swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Don't panic. Just keep driving. I tried to think. The road was too dark to see the driver's face. Their headlights were blinding in my mirror, but they weren't flashing. They weren't honking. They weren't trying to pass me. They were just following. And that was worse. A mile ahead, I knew there was an old gas station, abandoned for years. I made a split-second decision. I would pull over, see if they passed me. If they did, I was just being paranoid. If they didn't, I didn't let myself finish that thought. I pulled onto the shoulder, my heart hammering. The car slowed down. For a long moment, it just sat there, waiting. Then, it pulled over too, a few car lengths behind me. My blood ran cold. This wasn't normal. This wasn't random. Whoever was in that car, they had been waiting for me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring into my mirror, waiting for them to get out. But they didn't. They just sat there too, watching, waiting. I could barely see their car through the glare of their headlights, but I could feel them. I could feel their eyes on me, like they were trying to decide what to do next. And suddenly, I knew, if I stayed here, if I let them make the next move, I wouldn't make it home. I slammed my foot on the gas. My tires screeched against the pavement, my car lurching forward. The other car did the same. I flew down the road, my speedometer climbing past 60, 70, 80 miles per hour. The trees blurred around me, the road twisting and turning. But they kept up. No hesitation, no slowing down, just relentless, predatory pursuit. I was terrified. My hands were slick with sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I checked the fuel gauge, half a tank. I checked my phone, no signal. And then, up ahead, the fork in the road. I had two options. The left road led home. The right road led deeper into the woods, nowhere. A dead end. I had no time to think. I took the right road. The second I turned, I killed my headlights. I yanked the wheel hard, sending my car skidding onto a dirt path just off the road. And then I waited, heart pounding, hands shaking, breath shallow, praying they didn't see me. The car rushed past, its headlights sweeping over the road ahead. And then, it stopped. My stomach clenched. I could barely breathe. I watched as the car sat there, idling. They were looking for me. They knew I had turned. They just didn't know where. For a long moment, they didn't move. And then, slowly, they turned off their headlights and started rolling backward, searching. I pressed myself down in my seat, my whole body trembling. If they found me, I didn't let myself finish that thought. I just waited, praying, listening to the slow, steady crunch of gravel as their tires rolled back toward me. My hand hovered over the gear shift, ready to run. But then, a miracle. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Another car. For the first time that night, I wasn't alone. The second car pulled onto the road, its bright beams cutting through the darkness. The stalker's car hesitated. Then, without warning, they sped off into the night. I sat there, shaking, watching their taillights vanish down the road. For a long time, I couldn't move. Then I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers and called 911. The cops never found the car. No plates, no leads, nothing. But I know what I saw. I know what almost happened. And I know, without a doubt, if that second car hadn't come along, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I don't drive Old Mill Road anymore. And if you ever find yourself driving a dark, empty road at night, and someone starts following you, don't stop, don't wait, and whatever you do, don't let them catch you. Small towns come with their fair share of ghost stories, but I never put much stock in them. Stories about haunted houses, things lurking in the woods, and shadows that moved on their own. It was all just campfire talk. At least, that's what I believed. Until the night I saw it myself. I grew up in a town so small that it didn't even have a stoplight. Just a handful of streets, a single diner, and an old general store that still sold penny candy. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, and where the woods stretched endlessly in every direction. And those woods? They had their own stories. People talked about the shadow, a tall, thin figure that moved between the trees. Some claimed it was a ghost, the spirit of an old hermit who had lived deep in the forest. Others said it was something else, something not quite human. My parents always said it was nonsense, just a tale to keep kids from wandering too far into the trees. But I never liked the woods at night. And after what happened when I was 12, I never went near them again. It was summer, long days, warm nights, and nothing to do but ride bikes and explore. My best friend Tommy and I spent most of our time outside, running through the fields, climbing trees, and daring each other to go farther into the woods than we were supposed to. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we were playing near the edge of the forest. My mom had called for me to come inside, but Tommy had one last idea. "Let's go to the clearing," he said, grinning. The clearing was about a 10-minute walk into the trees, a small patch of open space surrounded by thick woods. During the day, it wasn't so bad, but at night, it felt different. "Come on," Tommy urged. "Just for a minute." I hesitated. "It's almost dark." "So? We have flashlights." I should have said no, but I didn't want him to think I was scared. So I followed him. The walk there was easy enough. We talked about baseball, about school, about the new arcade game we wanted to try. But as soon as we stepped into the clearing, everything changed. The air felt thicker, like it was harder to breathe. The trees around us were so still, as if they were listening, and the sounds of the forest, the crickets, the rustling leaves, had completely vanished. I shivered. Maybe we should go back? Tommy laughed, but it sounded forced. What, afraid of the dark? I was about to respond when I noticed something. On the far side of the clearing, between the trees, something moved. It was just a flicker at first, a shift in the darkness, like a shadow detaching itself from the trees. Then it took shape, tall, thin, too tall, and watching us. My chest tightened. "Tommy!" He turned to look, and then he froze. The shadow took a step forward, not walking, gliding, like it wasn't touching the ground. A long, unnatural limb reached out, curling around the trunk of a tree, fingers too long, too thin. Then, it tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion, like it was studying us. I grabbed Tommy's arm. "Run." We bolted. Branches whipped against my arms as we tore through the trees, our feet barely touching the ground. I could hear Tommy breathing heavily beside me, but neither of us dared to look back. We ran until the trees thinned, until the porch lights of our houses came into view. Then, finally, we stopped, doubled over, gasping for breath. We turned back toward the woods. It was gone. The trees stood silent, empty, like nothing had ever been there. But we knew better, and from that night on, we never went back. I tried to forget about it, but sometimes, at night, I'd wake up to a strange tapping sound on my window. Rhythmic, soft, like fingertips on glass. And sometimes, when I walked home after sunset, I'd get the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight, just beyond the tree line. I never told anyone, not until years later, when Tommy went missing. It happened on a cold October night. By then, we were both 18, getting ready to leave for college. We hadn't talked about the shadow in the woods for years, pretending that it had just been our imagination. Then one night, Tommy texted me, "I think it's back." I stared at my phone, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" No response. I called him, straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. Something felt wrong. The next morning, his mom called mine. Tommy had never come home. His truck was still parked in his driveway. His phone was found on his nightstand. But Tommy was gone. The whole town searched for him. They combed the fields, the streets, the rivers, and of course, the woods. But they never found him. Not a footprint. Not a single piece of clothing. It was like he had just vanished. The last time I saw Tommy was that night in the clearing. And sometimes I wonder, did we bring something back with us? Did we wake something up? And when it couldn't take me, did it take him instead? I moved away after that, tried to forget. But even now, years later, I still wake up to tapping on my window. And sometimes, when I pass by the woods, I see something. Just for a second. A shadow, shifting between the trees. Too tall, too thin, watching, waiting. And I know, it's still looking for me. Some nights, the air is too still, the silence too deep, like the world itself is holding its breath. That was the kind of night it was when the man tried to break into my house. And the worst part? I had no idea he was already inside. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors. It wasn't out of ignorance, there was just never a reason to. Everyone knew each other. People looked out for their neighbors. Bad things didn't happen here. At least, that's what we thought. That's what we wanted to believe. Until the night I learned the truth. I was alone that night. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, and I was excited to have the house to myself. I wasn't scared. I was 17, practically an adult. I had been alone before. It wasn't a big deal. I spent the evening on the couch, watching TV and scrolling through my phone. My two dogs, Max and Rex, were curled up beside me, snoring softly. The house was quiet, peaceful. Nothing felt wrong. Not yet. It was almost 2 a.m. when I heard it. A sound, a soft thud, like something moving. I sat up, blinking. The house was silent again. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was the dogs shifting in their sleep. I settled back into the couch. Then, a slow, deliberate creak, like a footstep on the stairs. I froze. My bedroom was upstairs. I hadn't been up there since before dinner. The only other people with a key were my parents, and they weren't home. So who was on the stairs? I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, nothing. The silence stretched long, deep. Then, another creak, closer this time. I turned to the dogs, expecting them to be on alert, but they were still asleep. I frowned. Max barked at everything. A car door closing outside, the wind rattling a window. He always heard it. But now, with something moving inside the house, nothing. My stomach twisted. I reached for my phone and quickly typed out a message to my friend Jake. Someone's in my house. Then I pressed call. The dial tone barely rang once before the call was answered. But the voice on the other end wasn't Jake. It was breathing. Slow, raspy, deliberate. My blood ran cold. Then, from the hallway, I heard the same breathing. Close. Too close. It was coming from the bottom of the stairs. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears, I thought I might pass out. I gripped my phone tighter, my fingers slick with sweat. Then, a voice. Low. Wrong. Like someone trying to sound normal but failing. I know you're awake. I almost screamed. I clamped a hand over my mouth, squeezing my eyes shut. This couldn't be real. Then the doorknob twisted. Slowly. Testing. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. I was trapped. The front door was too far away. The only way out was through the kitchen, but that meant passing the hallway. Passing him. I looked at the dogs. Still asleep. Unmoving. Almost too still. A horrible thought crept into my mind. What if he already did something to them? The doorknob jiggled harder. I grabbed the baseball bat from the corner of the room and gripped it tightly. My only chance was to run. Run, swing, and pray I made it to the door before he could grab me. I took a deep breath. Then, the dogs woke up. Not slowly, not groggy. They snapped awake instantly. And they weren't barking. They were growling. Deep, low, unfamiliar. Max and Rex had always been protective, but this was different. Their hackles were raised, lips curled back, teeth bared. They weren't just alert. They were ready to kill. The man must have sensed it too, because for the first time, he hesitated. A long, tense pause. Then, from the other side of the door, footsteps, retreating. The dogs went wild. They lunged at the door, barking, snarling, scratching. Then, a crash, a thud, a scream. I ran. I didn't stop to think. I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the front door, threw it open, and ran into the street. I didn't even realize I was screaming until I heard my own voice echo through the night. Lights flicked on in the neighbors' houses. Doors opened. Someone grabbed me. Mr. Calloway from next door. What's wrong? The dogs, I gasped. There's someone inside. He didn't wait. He ran straight for my house. A few others followed, all of them older men. Strong, former military, the kind of small-town guys who didn't wait for the cops. I stood on the sidewalk, shaking, my vision tunneling. Then I heard it, a gunshot. Then another. Then silence. I don't remember much after that. Just flashing lights, sirens, voices shouting. Someone wrapped a blanket around me. My mom's voice, frantic and breaking over the phone. Then, finally, a body bag being wheeled out of my house. The man had still been inside. He had been hiding, waiting. And the worst part? The cops said he had been there for hours. Not just after I heard the noises. Not just since midnight. Longer. They found food wrappers in my bedroom closet. A pile of my clothes that had gone missing weeks ago, stacked neatly under my bed. He had been watching me sleep, listening, waiting for the right moment. And that night, he had decided it was time. But the dogs, the ones who hadn't reacted earlier, who had slept through the first sounds, they had known the whole time. They weren't sleeping. They were waiting too. And when the time came, they saved my life. I moved out of that house a month later. My parents didn't even argue. We packed up and left. But sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, breath shaky, feeling like I'm being watched. And I wonder, what if the dogs hadn't been there? What if I had opened the door? And what if, one night, he comes back? There's something eerie about driving alone at night. The way the world outside the windshield turns into nothing but darkness and shadows. The way headlights behind you feel like eyes watching. The way your own reflection in the glass can start to feel like someone else sitting beside you. I had never been afraid of driving at night, until the night I realized I wasn't alone on the road, and that someone had been following me for hours. I was 22 when it happened. I had just finished visiting my mom in California and was driving back home to Colorado. It was a 12-hour trip, one I had done before, but this time, I left later than expected. By the time I hit the Nevada desert, the sun had long since set, and the road stretched out in front of me, endless and empty. The desert at night is a lonely place. No streetlights, no houses, no gas stations for miles. Just the two-lane highway and the occasional pair of headlights in the rearview mirror. I first noticed the car about an hour after I left town. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Just another traveler on the road. But after another 30 minutes, I realized something. They were still behind me. Not too close. Not tailgating. But keeping their distance. Matching my speed. Never passing. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were headed in the same direction. Maybe I was overthinking it. But the longer it went on, the more that nagging feeling crept up my spine. 2 hours passed. The car was still there. I switched lanes. They switched lanes. I slowed down. They slowed down. I sped up. So did they. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. This wasn't a coincidence. They were following me. My brain started racing. What did they want? Were they planning to rob me? Run me off the road? Or worse? I checked my fuel gauge. A quarter tank left. Enough to keep going, but not enough to last the rest of the trip. I would have to stop eventually, and that scared me more than anything. I reached into the passenger seat, fumbling for my phone. I needed to call someone, anyone, just to feel less alone. No signal. My stomach dropped. I was in the middle of nowhere. If something happened, no one would hear me scream. No one would find me. Up ahead, a green sign loomed on the side of the road. Next rest stop, 5 miles. A rest stop. Maybe there would be other people there. Maybe it would be safe. I made a split-second decision. I would pull in. If they followed me, I would know for sure. The minutes dragged. The exit came into view. I flicked on my turn signal. The car behind me did the same. My pulse skyrocketed. I pulled into the parking lot, my headlights sweeping across the empty spaces. It was deserted. No other cars. No lights. Just a row of vending machines, a single flickering street lamp, and the entrance to a pitch-black restroom building. I swallowed hard. The other car pulled in behind me, parking a few spaces away. Not too close, but close enough. I didn't move, didn't turn off my engine. I just sat there, watching my mirror, waiting. A long minute passed. Then, the driver's side door of the car creaked open. A figure stepped out. A man, tall, dressed in dark clothes. His face was hidden by the shadows, and he just stood there, not walking toward me, not going to the vending machines, just standing, watching, waiting. My entire body screamed, "Get out." I threw the car into reverse so fast my tires screeched. The man took a step forward. I slammed on the gas. My tires spun on the pavement before catching, and my car lurched backward out of the parking lot. The man started running toward me. I barely missed hitting a trash can as I sped onto the highway, my heart pounding out of my chest. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The man froze, watching me speed away. Then, slowly, he turned, walked back to his car, and got in. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. I was breathing too fast, my chest tight. The speedometer climbed past 80, 90, 100 miles per hour. I kept glancing at my mirror. For a moment, the road behind me was empty. Then, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and they were getting closer. I had to think. I couldn't outrun them forever. I needed to get to people, to safety. But where? Another green sign loomed ahead. Next exit, 2 miles. It wasn't a town, but it was something. I took the exit without thinking. A gas station sat just off the highway, its bright neon sign a beacon in the darkness. I pulled in fast, nearly hitting the gas pump. A few other cars were parked outside. A clerk stood inside, leaning on the counter. I barely put the car in park before throwing the door open and running inside. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, looked up, startled. I must have looked like a lunatic. I was shaking, breathing hard, terrified. I tried to speak, but the words got stuck in my throat. She frowned. "You okay, sweetheart?" I turned, looking through the glass windows. The car had pulled into the lot across the street, just far enough away to stay out of the light, just close enough to watch me. I turned back to the clerk. "I think someone's following me," I whispered. Her expression darkened. She grabbed a phone off the counter and dialed. A few minutes later, a police cruiser pulled in. The car across the street? Gone. The officer listened to my story. He took my information. Then he sighed. "You're not the first." My skin crawled. "People have reported being followed on that stretch of highway before," he said. "Always at night. Always alone." I swallowed hard. "Did they ever catch him?" I asked. The officer's face was grim. "No," he said. "I never saw that car again. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I feel it. That same presence. That same weight in the air. Like someone, somewhere, is still watching. Still waiting. For the next person to drive down that empty road. Alone." There are some things that stick with you forever. Moments so bizarre, so surreal, that even years later, you find yourself asking, did that really happen? I was 17 when a kid in my high school walked into class dressed as a clown, and by the time the cops dragged him away, we realized he wasn't wearing a costume. It was the fall of my senior year, just a few months until graduation, and everything felt like it was moving too fast. Teachers were piling on last-minute assignments, college applications were due, and all anyone could talk about was prom. Everything was normal, until the morning it wasn't. I remember walking into first period like I did every day. It was a small class, maybe 15 kids, taught by Mr. Evans, the kind of teacher who never raised his voice but could still scare the hell out of you when he was mad. That morning felt like any other. People were yawning, texting under their desks, barely listening as Mr. Evans started the lesson. Then, the door creaked open. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway was a kid in a clown mask. The cheap plastic kind you buy at a Halloween store. White face, exaggerated red smile, black holes for eyes. We all just stared. Someone laughed nervously. Then Mr. Evans sighed. "All right, very funny. Take off the mask and sit down." The kid didn't move. That's when I noticed the jacket. Not a costume, just a plain black hoodie, and jeans, and sneakers. It wasn't a Halloween prank. It was someone we knew, and he wasn't supposed to be here. His name was Bradley Tate, a junior, kept to himself, barely spoke in class. Not exactly bullied, but not exactly liked either. He was just there, always sitting in the back of the room, head down, invisible. Until now. Now he was standing in the doorway, wearing a clown mask, and he was holding something in his hand. Mr. Evans' expression darkened. "Bradley," he said carefully, "what are you doing?" Bradley tilted his head. Then he stepped inside. That's when I saw it. The gun. No one moved. No one breathed. Mr. Evans went pale. "Bradley," he said slowly, raising his hands, "I need you to put that down." Bradley didn't answer, didn't react. He just walked to his desk, his usual seat in the back, and sat down. Like it was any other day. Like he hadn't just walked into a classroom with a gun. Someone let out a shaky breath. No one spoke. No one knew what to do. Bradley just sat there, the mask hiding his face, the gun resting on his desk. Watching. Waiting. Mr. Evans took a cautious step forward. "Bradley," he said softly, "what's going on?" Nothing. The room was dead silent. Then, Bradley started laughing. Not loud, not forced, just a soft, muffled giggle behind the plastic mask. Then, a knock on the door. The entire class jumped. A voice called from the hallway. "Mr. Evans? Everything okay?" Bradley's head snapped toward the door. The mask made it impossible to read his expression, but I felt the shift in his body language. Something changed. Something snapped. He stood up fast, the chair scraping against the floor. And that's when I saw it. The gun was fake. A plastic toy, painted black. No real trigger. No bullets. Just a prop. But by the time we realized it, it was too late. Bradley bolted for the door. Mr. Evans tried to grab him, but Bradley was too fast. He yanked it open and sprinted down the hall. The next few minutes were chaos. Mr. Evans ran after him, yelling for security. The rest of us just sat there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. Then, the alarm started blaring. Lockdown. We huddled under our desks, our hearts racing. The classroom door locked. Outside, we could hear footsteps pounding down the hall. Shouting. Then, the sound of someone being tackled to the ground. It was over in minutes. Police arrived. They dragged Bradley out in handcuffs. The mask was gone now, and for the first time, I saw his face. He wasn't angry, wasn't scared. He just looked empty. The next day, we found out the truth. Bradley had been planning it for weeks. He had written about it in a journal, how he wanted to scare them all, how he wanted to see their faces, how he wanted to be remembered. He had robbed a gas station earlier that morning, still wearing the mask, before coming straight to school. The gun had been real at the gas station. By the time he walked into our classroom, he had already thrown the real one away. He never gave a reason, never apologized, never explained why he did it. Just sat in the police station, staring at the walls, smiling to himself. Like he had one. Like this was exactly what he wanted. Bradley went to prison. He'll be there for a long time. But even now, years later, I still remember that moment in class. The silence, the tension, the way he laughed behind the mask. And sometimes, when I see someone in a cheap Halloween clown costume, I feel my stomach twist, because I'll never forget the way it felt, sitting in that classroom, watching a kid in a clown mask holding a gun, and realizing he wasn't joking. Lila worked the front counter at a small-town bakery, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. The mornings were always bustling with regulars grabbing their coffee and pastries before work, and the afternoons were slower, quieter, with the occasional elderly couple stopping in for a cup of tea. And then there was him. He came in every day, like clockwork, just before closing. Always alone, always quiet. He wasn't intimidating at first glance, just an average man in his mid-40s, wearing jeans and a jacket that looked a little too heavy for the weather. His hair was thinning, and his face was forgettable in the way that made him easy to ignore. But he was always watching her. At first, Lila didn't think much of it. She chalked it up to small-town friendliness. After all, he always smiled, and he was polite. "Hi there," he'd say every time he walked in. "Hi," she'd reply, flashing her practiced customer service smile. He never ordered much, just a coffee, black, and occasionally a slice of lemon cake. He'd sit in the corner by the window, nursing his coffee slowly, his eyes flickering up to her whenever he thought she wasn't looking. It wasn't unusual for people to linger in the bakery. It was cozy, warm, and smelled like sugar and cinnamon. But his presence made her uneasy in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't until the first note appeared that she began to feel truly afraid. It was a rainy Wednesday, just as the bakery was about to close. Lila was wiping down the tables while her coworker, Marcy, cleaned up the back kitchen. The man had come in, as always, sitting quietly in his corner until the clock struck 6. When he left, Lila went to his table to clear it. That's when she saw it. A piece of folded paper, sitting neatly next to his empty coffee cup. Her name was written on it. Frowning, she picked it up and unfolded it. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." That was all it said. No name, no signature, just those words in shaky handwriting. She stared at it for a moment, her stomach tightening. It could have been from anyone, but deep down, she already knew. The man didn't come in the next day, or the day after. For a moment, she thought maybe that was it. Maybe he'd gotten scared and decided to leave her alone. But then the letters started coming. At first, they were just left at the counter. Short, harmless messages scribbled on scraps of paper. "You brighten my day. I can't stop thinking about you." Then they got longer. "You're the only person who's ever been kind to me. I feel like you see me when no one else does. I wish I could talk to you more, but I'm too scared. I don't know how to act around you. You're so perfect. I feel like you're an angel, sent here to save me." Lila showed the notes to Marcy, who laughed it off. "Looks like someone's got a crush," she teased. "He's harmless, though. Just some lonely guy." But it didn't feel harmless. The letters started arriving at her apartment. The first one showed up on a Friday night. She had just gotten home from work, kicking off her shoes and tossing her keys onto the counter when she noticed the envelope on the floor. It had been slipped under her door, her name written in the same shaky handwriting as the notes from the bakery. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and opened it. Inside was a longer letter, more rambling, more desperate. "I can't stop thinking about you. I know it's wrong to feel this way, but I can't help it. I see the way you look at me. You're so kind, so gentle. I've never felt this way before. I dream about you at night. I wish I could hold you, touch your face, tell you how much I care about you." Her stomach turned. How did he know where she lived? She called Marcy, her voice shaking as she read the letter aloud. "Okay, that's definitely creepy," Marcy admitted. "Maybe you should tell the cops." "What can they do?" Lila snapped, her frustration masking her fear. "He hasn't threatened me. He hasn't done anything illegal." "Not yet," Marcy said quietly. The letters kept coming. Every day, she'd find a new one under her door. Some were long and rambling, others short and simple. But all of them had the same obsessive tone. Lila started sleeping with the lights on. She double-checked the locks on her door every night. She kept her phone by her side at all times, her finger hovering over 911 whenever she heard a strange noise. But he never tried to break in. He never called her. He just watched. She started seeing him more often. He'd stand across the street from the bakery, pretending to look at his phone, but always glancing up at her through the window. She caught him outside her apartment building once, leaning against a lamppost, his face shadowed in the dim light. She didn't sleep that night. Then one day, the letters stopped. She didn't find anything under her door for a week. He didn't come to the bakery. He didn't stand across the street. At first, she felt relieved. Then she felt terrified. Had he given up? Or was he planning something worse? The answer came 2 weeks later. It was a Saturday morning, and the bakery was busy. Lila was rushing back and forth between the counter and the kitchen when she noticed a man standing near the door. Not him. This man was younger, tall, with a buzz cut and a badge clipped to his belt. "Lila?" he asked, stepping forward. "Yes?" He took a deep breath. "My name's Detective Harris. I need to ask you a few questions about a man named Walter Griggs." Lila froze. The detective's face was grim. "Do you know him?" He comes to the bakery sometimes," she said cautiously. Harris nodded. "We found him last night. In his apartment." Something in his tone made her stomach drop. He'd been dead for at least a week. Suicide. Her breath caught in her throat. But then Harris hesitated. "And that's not all we found." He pulled out a small stack of photos. Lila stared at them, her heart pounding. They were of her. Taken through the bakery window. Taken outside her apartment. Taken while she was walking to work, sitting in her car, even standing in her own living room. She felt like she was going to be sick. "He had hundreds of these," Harris said quietly. "He'd been following you for months." Lila clutched the counter to steady herself. "But that's not all," Harris continued. "We also found letters. Dozens of them. Written to you, but never sent." He handed her one of the letters. She didn't want to read it, but she did. And when she got to the last line, her blood ran cold. "If I can't have you, no one can." She looked up at Harris, her voice barely above a whisper. What was he planning to do? Harris's face was grim. "We think he was building up the courage to kill you." Lila moved out of town a week later, but sometimes, even now, she swears she can still feel him watching her. Rachel had always been a night owl, and she loved the quiet of the late hours when the world felt slower. She was in her early 20s, living in a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. After dinner, she decided to run to the grocery store to pick up a few things. It was 9:45 p.m. when she pulled into the parking lot. The store was nearly empty, as it usually was this time of night. Just a couple of cars scattered across the lot, their windows reflecting the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights. Rachel grabbed a cart and strolled through the automatic doors, humming softly to herself. The aisles were quiet except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the occasional squeak of her cart's wheels. She liked shopping at this time, when she didn't have to deal with crowds or long checkout lines. But as she walked down the canned goods aisle, something made her pause. It was the feeling of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder and saw two men standing at the end of the aisle. They weren't shopping. They weren't even pretending to. One of them leaned casually against the shelf, while the other stood a step behind him, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. Both of them were staring at her. Rachel's stomach tightened. She quickly turned back to her cart, grabbing a can of soup and placing it in with a shaky hand. "It's fine," she told herself. "They're probably just being weird. This is a small town. People stare." She pushed her cart to the next aisle, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling. But as she browsed the cereal selection, she saw them again. They weren't at the end of the aisle this time. They were halfway down, closer, still staring. Rachel's pulse quickened. This wasn't normal. She grabbed a box of cereal at random and moved quickly to the next aisle. For a moment, she thought she had lost them. She scanned the rows of shelves, looking for any sign of movement, but the aisle was empty. She exhaled a shaky breath, her grip tightening on the cart. But when she turned the corner into the frozen food section, there they were. This time, they weren't pretending. They were standing in the middle of the aisle, side by side, their faces expressionless, their eyes locked on her. Rachel froze. For a moment, none of them moved. Then one of the men took a step forward. Her fight or flight instinct kicked in, and she turned sharply, abandoning her cart. She hurried toward the front of the store, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the faint sound of their footsteps behind her. The cashier was a young guy, maybe 18, with earbuds in and a bored expression on his face. He didn't even look up as she approached. "Hey," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "Can you call your manager?" The cashier raised an eyebrow, pulling out one earbud. Why?" "There are two men following me," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. But the aisle behind her was empty. The cashier blinked at her. "Where?" "They were just—" She turned fully, scanning the store. The men were gone. The cashier shrugged, slipping his earbud back in. Probably just some weirdos. You want me to walk you to your car or something? Rachel hesitated. She didn't want to bother him. And besides, what if they weren't really following her? What if she was overreacting? She shook her head. No, it's fine. Thanks. The parking lot was quiet, the harsh fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the pavement. Rachel walked quickly toward her car, her keys clenched tightly in her fist. Her eyes darted around, scanning every car, every corner, every shadow. She reached her car without incident and let out a shaky breath. But as she unlocked the door and climbed inside, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Two figures, standing by a car near the edge of the lot. The same two men. They weren't staring at her this time. They were talking, their heads close together, their voices too low for her to hear. But she knew they were talking about her. Rachel didn't waste time. She locked her doors, started the car, and pulled out of the parking lot as quickly as she could without drawing attention. She glanced in her rearview mirror. The men were still standing there, watching her car disappear into the night. Rachel's apartment wasn't far from the grocery store, just a short drive through a few quiet neighborhoods. She tried to calm herself, taking slow, deep breaths as she drove. It's fine, she told herself. They didn't follow me. They were just being creepy. It's over. But as she pulled onto her street, her headlights illuminated a familiar car parked a few houses down. A dark sedan. The same one the men had been standing by. Her breath caught in her throat. She slowed down, her hands trembling on the wheel. She could barely make out the figures inside, but she knew it was them. They had followed her. Rachel's first instinct was to keep driving, but she didn't want to lead them to her apartment. Instead, she sped up, turning sharply onto the next street. She circled the block, her mind racing. What should she do? Should she call the police? What if they thought she was overreacting? What if? She spotted a gas station up ahead and pulled in, parking directly under the bright overhead lights. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed her sister's number. "Hello?" Her sister answered, her voice groggy. "Emma, I need you to stay on the phone with me," Rachel said quickly. "What's wrong?" "There are two men following me. They were at the grocery store, and now they're parked near my apartment. I don't know what to do." Emma was wide awake now. "Rachel, call the police." "I don't. Now." Rachel hesitated, then nodded to herself. She hung up and dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, reassuring. "Stay where you are," they said. "We're sending a patrol car to your location." Rachel sat there, her hands shaking on the wheel, her eyes scanning the parking lot for any sign of the sedan. 5 minutes later, the police arrived. The officers were kind, patient. They listened as Rachel told them everything, from the men in the grocery store to the car parked near her apartment. They promised to check it out and escorted her home, parking outside while she locked her door and turned on every light in her apartment. That night, she didn't sleep, but the men didn't come back. At least, not that she knew of. Months later, Rachel saw a news report about a string of kidnappings in the area. 2 men had been arrested. Their method was always the same. They'd stalk their victims in public places, follow them home, and strike when the time was right. Rachel's stomach turned as their mugshots flashed across the screen. It was them, the men from the grocery store. She had been lucky, but she would never forget how close she had come. Small towns are strange places. They have a way of holding on to things. Old buildings, old secrets, and old stories that never quite fade. Some of those stories are harmless, the kind of myths kids tell each other to pass the time. But some of them feel like they were never meant to be told at all. And in my town, one of those stories belonged to St. Mary's Church. I had always thought of churches as safe places. My grandma used to tell me that no evil could enter holy ground. But if that was true, then what the hell did we see that night? It started with a dare. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Lucas, his cousin Mark, and Mark's girlfriend, Jenna. We were all 17, except for Mark, who had just turned 18 and acted like he was too cool for the rest of us. It was a Saturday night in late October, and we were bored. Small town bored. The kind of restless boredom that makes you do stupid things just for the sake of doing them. That's when Lucas brought up the church. St. Mary's had been abandoned for years. It sat on the outskirts of town, its once white walls now weathered and gray, the wooden doors chained shut. People still maintained the cemetery out back, but the church itself had been left to rot. And of course it was haunted. The story went that decades ago, the pastor had hanged himself inside. No one knew why. Some said he had gone insane, convinced he was hearing voices. Others claimed he had been hiding some terrible secret that he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Either way, they found him swinging from the rafters, his face purple, his eyes bulging. And ever since then, strange things happened at St. Mary's. People who wandered too close at night claimed they could hear whispers coming from inside. Others swore they had seen something moving in the darkness beyond the stained glass windows, even though the doors were locked. Most people just avoided the place. But not us. The plan was simple. Sneak into the church, stay inside for 10 minutes, and film the whole thing for proof. Mark, ever the genius, had brought bolt cutters to get through the chain on the doors. We parked a few blocks away and walked in the rest of the way, flashlights cutting through the chilly night air. The church loomed ahead of us, its roof silhouetted against the cloudy sky. The stained glass windows were shattered in places, black voids where light should have been. I felt uneasy the second we stepped onto the property. The air was too still. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of crickets. It was like the whole world had gone silent. Lucas was the first to break it. "All right, let's get this over with." Mark grinned, lifting the bolt cutters. With one sharp snap, the chain fell to the ground. The doors creaked open, and we stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Dust, mildew, and something else, something rotting. The church was a mess. Pews were overturned, old hymn books scattered across the floor. The altar stood at the far end, covered in a thick layer of dust. Above it, the wooden rafters stretched into the darkness. Mark pulled out his phone. "We gotta get the shot of the ceiling. That's where the dude..." The lights flickered. We all froze. For a split second, I thought maybe it was just our flashlights, but then I realized there weren't supposed to be any lights. The church had no power. And yet, the chandelier above us had flickered, just once, as if something had passed in front of it. Jenna grabbed Mark's arm. "Let's go." "Relax," Mark laughed, but his voice was unsteady. "It's just old wiring or something." Lucas turned his flashlight toward the altar. "Dude, do you hear that?" We listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I did. A faint creaking sound. Rhythmic. Slow. Like a rope swaying back and forth. I turned my flashlight toward the ceiling. Nothing. "All right," Mark said, trying to sound casual. 10 minutes. We just got a last 10 minutes. He started recording on his phone, panning across the empty pews. "Welcome to St. Mary's," he said in a mock spooky voice. "Home of our friendly neighborhood ghost priest." Jenna elbowed him. "Stop." Mark rolled his eyes, aiming his phone at the ceiling. "If you're here, give us a sign." The creaking stopped, and something thumped onto the floor behind us. We spun around so fast Jenna almost tripped. The double doors we had come through were shut, and on the floor beneath them, a single length of rope. Frayed, old, covered in something dark. We stared at it in stunned silence. Then a voice whispered from the rafters. "Get out." Jenna screamed. Lucas bolted. Mark dropped his phone. And then I saw it. A shadow in the rafters. Not a shape. Not a person. Just darkness, shifting unnaturally, watching us. The doors flew open behind us, slamming against the walls. We ran. We didn't stop until we were back at the car. Jenna was sobbing. Mark was cursing under his breath, his hands shaking. Lucas was staring straight ahead, pale as a ghost. I turned back toward the church, panting. The doors were still open. The rope was gone. And somewhere inside, I swore I could still hear it. That slow, creaking sound. Back and forth. Back and forth. Like a body, swinging. The next morning, Mark went back for his phone. It was sitting in the middle of the aisle, untouched. When he checked the video, most of it was just darkness and static. But near the end, for just a few seconds, the camera had captured something in the rafters. Something hanging. Something that hadn't been there when we looked. We never talked about that night again, and we never went back to the church. because some places don't let go of their ghosts. And I think something in there saw us, and I don't think it's forgotten.